Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to UUBOICETips and Belo-Osagie's Investigations, Compliance and Ethics Team's September Series 2020. For those who do not know us well, UUBOICETips and Belo-Osagie was founded in 1983 and has since evolved from its initial focus on oil and gas matters into a 15-partner multi-specialization full-service firm comprising 72 associates. The firm is geared to facilitate corporate and commercial business in Nigeria and Africa across its practice areas, one of which is the Investigations, Compliance and Ethics practice area. The UUBOICE team, as we refer to it, has over the past 2 years put together various events that offer our clients and wider learning community the chance to get up to date on the latest developments in investigations, compliance, and ethics. The September Series 2020 is the latest installment of this initiative. At 2 p.m. every Wednesday for the next few weeks, UUBO will host several leading voices in the ICE space as they offer timely and actionable insights into core issues in investigations, corporate governance and ethics, dawn raids, and data protection. We look forward to your participation at these webinars and ask that you please save the dates in your calendars. Today's webinar, which promises to be a revelatory and informative one, is on crisis management. We have a crisis management masterclass this morning that will be moderated by our senior partner, Mr. Daniel Agbo, who himself sits on many boards and is a trusted advisor to many private and listed companies. I will now hand over to Mr. Agbo to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers for this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Lolade. Look, we have a fantastic panel with us today that deals that's going to talk about how crisis and the planning for how to deal with crisis can be dealt with at various stages, pre-crisis, when a crisis happens, and in many ways, both when a crisis happens and after a crisis happens, how you engage with the public and with your internal constituency. So we have a great panel with us today. Very, very kindly agreed to share their knowledge with us. And I'll start by introducing you to Chris Saul. Chris Saul is the founder of Christopher Saul Associates, an advisory firm that provides independent, trusted advice to senior executives and key stakeholders within publicly quoted and privately owned businesses and professional services firms. Now, Chris is in many ways a legend for those of us who are lawyers on the call. Chris is a legend in our business because prior to establishing Christopher Saul Associates, Chris Saul was senior partner at Slaughter and May from 2008 to 2016, and he has a wealth of experience both as a business leader and as a board advisor and practitioner in corporate transactions and governance best practices. So Chris will be talking about what a crisis is, different types of crisis, and essentially how boards of companies can ready themselves to deal with crisis. Also on the panel today is Tony Sani. Tony is one of our brethren, a lawyer, although not one that currently practices, but a lawyer, which is great. She's also an investment banker. She's a chartered secretary, a stockbroker, an author. Tony was Group Chief Executive Officer of United Capital, formerly a subsidiary of the United Bank for Africa PLC, for 4 years until 2018, when she established Emerging Africa Capital, where she is the group CEO. The mission of the Emerging Africa Capital Group that Toyin leads is to be the leading catalyst for Africa's emergence as a key global investment origin and destination. And with the benefit of her experience, Toyin is going to tell us what a company does when crisis happens. Then we also have on the panel Mr. Yomi Badejo Okusan. Yomi is the Group Managing Director of CMC Connect, a leading communications group with over 27 years of experience in delivering bespoke strategic communication solutions to its clients. When I was writing this blurb, I went to CMC Connect's website, and the tagline, I think that's the word, on their website is Perception Managers. And I thought it was spot on, because that's what you need when a crisis hits. You need people that are going to help you manage perceptions, both internally and externally. So before I hand you over to Chris Saul, let me say this, that COVID is the defining crisis of certainly of my lifetime, and I suspect it will be the defining crisis of many people's lifetimes. And I think that before COVID, crisis management was just something that we read was, oh, it was great to have, something that boards were encouraged to do. But in like many things, it wasn't real. COVID has made it absolutely real. The bad news is that almost certainly COVID is not going to be the last crisis that companies and corporations are going to be faced with. So both in terms of learning for how we will continue, we all on this call are going to continue to deal with COVID, and then also in terms of how we're going to deal with the various crises that will inevitably arise in the future. I think that this webinar is particularly timely, and I'm myself are looking forward to picking up a few points from here. So, Chris, over to you.
Dan, thank you so much, and thank you for your two gracious words. It's an absolute honor to be with you and everybody today to talk about crisis management. So a few points from me. Starting point, of course, is, well, what is a crisis? And as you do, I went to the Oxford English Dictionary to find that is a time of great danger, difficulty, or doubt when problems must be solved or important decisions made, which I think is a good encapsulation of a crisis. A crisis can happen at any time, and the only thing that you can be sure of is that it won't be convenient. So just a few examples of crises that can strike a company. Loss of a key person. Some of you may remember the tragic plane accident, Christmas 2017, when Richard Cousins, then the CEO of Compass Group, a large catering group, was lost in that crash together with family members. So the CEO was just lost to the company. An environmental accident, obviously Deepwater Horizon for BP in 2010. A major regulatory issue. I'm sure we'll all remember the famous Elon Musk tweet on his way somewhere when he said that, quotes, funding was secured, unquotes, for his project of Tesla, thereby triggering a lot of chaos. A data hack, increasingly BA suffered a data hack in 2018 affecting the personal and financial information of no fewer than 380,000 passengers. Product crisis, obviously VW's Dieselgate saga, which was started in 2015. Unexpected takeover approach, and then to your opening comments, Dan, an industry or economy-wide event that just comes out of a clear blue sky. And classically, of course, that has been the COVID pandemic that has shaken the world, following on the heels in 28 of the global financial crisis. So that's the spectrum of crises, and as I think one can see, they come in all shapes and forms. And some of those crises are easier to prepare for than others. Takeovers, for example. Many companies have defense manuals outlining key early responses, processes for convening the board, template announcements. Dawn raids, often practiced, and critical issues like, so what's a privileged document? They're worked through. I vividly remember one morning in 2010, I was sitting with my coffee at my desk, 9:15, the phone rings. It was General Counsel at a large multinational based in London, who said, in an alarmed way, "The commissioner here, oh my God." So I said, okay, I'll be there in 20 minutes for the team. Two things. Number one, check their authority. And number two, give them coffee. So I gathered a team of 6 colleagues and we were there within 20 minutes and we spent the rest of the day watching over the commission. And luckily, of course, these processes have been worked through. And then data breaches. These days, many companies advisedly conduct war game exercises with outside consultants who really test the fragility or otherwise of their systems. So these outside consultants will typically try and break in to the IT systems and they succeed or fail. But that, of course, is a big learning experience for the company. Important to remember, of course, that data are the new oil and data leaks can be absolutely toxic. But more generally, and in addition to specific examples, companies should, of course, develop a crisis management plan. And that plan, I believe, should grow naturally out of the risk register that all companies will have and be the work product of a core team, and that core team would naturally be the head of audit and risk, the CFO, and the general counsel, with, of course, input from the chair and the CEO, approved by the board and updated at least once a year. Ideally, there should be periodic surprise exercises, as with a fire drill at the office. We did one of these at one of our general counsel days, and the CEO of quite a large company was very sporting, and he allowed himself to be kidnapped by environmental activists so that collectively we could work through that particular crisis. In outline, the plan should define the incidents that rise to the level of a crisis. Not everything is a crisis. So identifying exactly what the crisis is, and then articulate in checklist form those tasks which each department needs to take in the first 24 to 48 hours of the crisis sitting, with each task having a task owner. Important point, obvious point, but the first 24 to 48 hours are absolutely key, because if you don't calmly grip the crisis in those 24 to 48 hours, the crisis will grip you. Secondly, I'm sure we'll come on to talk about this more, but describe the crisis communication strategy for each type of crisis, and to the extent possible include template holding statements and such like. Next, including an up-to-date contact list, including details of external advisors who will be most appropriate to each particular crisis. Normally, of course, a PR consultant to help us, Dan's just said, to manage perceptions, absolutely critical. Probably the relationship partner or the relevant regulatory specialist at a law firm, and often the audit partner at the firm's auditors. And then critically, the plan will want to nominate a project manager for each type of crisis, because that person's role will be to draw the strands together to really hold the ring and manage particularly the early stages of the crisis, and make sure that the CEO and the chairman are in the loop. Finally, if I may, just a few key themes as I see it in terms of front-footed crisis management. Number one, make sure that the CEO and chair know immediately what has happened and what's being done. They have key accountability in preserving shareholder value and looking to the best interests of the group, so they need to know. Secondly, the General Counsel will have a key role in thinking immediately about disclosure obligations. What does the market need to know? When to announce, what to announce. We've seen actually that there are really difficult judgments here, because you may not know exactly what the extent of the data breach is. So how do you craft the right kind of announcement? CFO will be central, of course, to an early assessment of financial implications of the crisis. We saw this in COVID. What are the liquidity implications of this? What do we really do about making sure that the finances are sustainable? Fourth point, it's generally better to be candid. It's obvious, really, but generally better to be candid about both the event and the timescales for sorting things out. And an example of this, some of you may remember the Travelex foreign exchange problem. It was a IT issue at the turn of the year, but there was a lot of criticism really about the amount of information that the company gave and the timescale within which things could realistically be sorted out. Fifthly, communicate, obviously, communicate regularly, clearly, both internally and externally. And for major crises, obviously the CEO should be prepared to lead the communications process. As you will remember, it didn't work out very well for Tony Hayward with BP, and he got a lot of criticism. But for major crises, the CEO needs to be there. Next point, is an investigation appropriate, and if so, by whom? So 3 points to mention here. Number one, often an external independent investigation can relieve pressure from the board. If the board has a major issue that it is just getting its arms around, it can actually be helpful to say, look, this is something that has many ripples, many tentacles, and we need an investigation. An example of that would be TSB, the Trustee Savings Bank, had a major IT problem a few years ago, and very wisely, they appointed Slaughter and May to lead an investigation, and that I think was thought to be helpful. Sometimes a board investigation, so not an external investigation, but an internal investigation, may be thought to be appropriate. It will depend on the event. An example there would be Rio Tinto. Some of you will remember the very unfortunate destruction of some old rock shelters in Western Australia in May 2020. And Rio put in place a board-led review of cultural heritage management, and that's just reported. And the third point on investigations is that where personal misbehavior is involved, or rather allegations of personal misbehavior, then an independent investigation may be simply essential. And one thinks here perhaps of Steve Easterbrook at McDonald's, but in those circumstances, it's going to be appropriate in most circumstances for there to be an external investigation. Then the final point in terms of these few points is be upfront with the regulators. Normally, it's important to be candid, open-handed with the regulators, because that will be appreciated by them. And it will store up important goodwill as things progress. And the absolutely final point, of course, is the obvious one that you should never let a crisis go to waste. And so when the dust has settled, a lessons learned exercise, what could we have done better? What can we improve in our systems going forward? And what other lessons can we learn and get a dividend out of what has probably been a ghastly experience? Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Chris. Before we check in with Toyin, I just realized that I hadn't covered a couple of housekeeping points that are probably useful, just in terms of giving everybody an idea of what to expect. So the idea is to have each of the panelists speak for around 15 minutes. Initial round of questions, 15 minutes, and if we have enough time, a second round of questions. And the idea also was that all the questions would be addressed at the end. I think that there is a Q&A button, so if you have any questions, you can answer the questions. You can raise the questions on the Zoom panel or whatever it's called. And at the end of the webinar, at the end of the panel, we will take the questions. Just in terms of timing, we always aim in these webinars to have the webinars end no later than an hour and a half after we start. So I promise you that we will be done for 3:30. So I think that covers the housekeeping points. One more, I think, sorry, is the webinar is going to be recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube, just in case you miss anything or you want to refer anybody else to it. So this for Toyin. You know, we're lawyers. Our job is to advise, but we don't often get the chance to be right there when our plans and advice are actually being executed. And you know, the way I like to hear it put is that they say no plan survives contact with the enemy, and certainly my rueful experience is that is very true. So, as a former and present CEO of a financial services company, what do you think management can or should do to ensure that a company's crisis management plan, if it has one, is actually useful in a crisis? Toyin.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you, UUBO, for the opportunity to speak at this very important webinar. I would like to start by saying that if at all we all thought that crisis was escapable, so to speak, COVID-19 has shown the whole world that sooner or later a crisis will arrive on your doorstep. And one of the things that I will say straight out in planning for crisis, for any organization, any institution, any country, any family, any individual, is that you have to think of anything that has ever happened before in the world. So if it happened 100 years ago, it could happen again. And so that means that we all have to have very robust and broad crisis management plans. In terms of the scope it would cover, it should cover the possibility of multiple adverse occurrences at the same time. And that has been the challenge for Nigeria, for example. So the fact that we have an economy that is just coming out of a recession, we have a very weak health care system, we are also facing a global pandemic. Incidentally, we have a currency that has in recent times been volatile. And then on top of that, we had a major crisis in terms of a price war between two major oil producers, which was Saudi Arabia and Russia. And all that together happened at the same time. And when you take all that together, of course, it escalates and exacerbates the impact of the crisis. So what I will say is that in crisis planning, you don't just plan for the ordinary or the foreseeable. You plan for the unforeseeable, and you plan for the possibility of multiple adverse events happening at the same time. If it has ever happened before, it just could happen again. So that for me would be the first lesson in crisis management. And it's a lesson that I think all of us need to take in. Now, crisis is a reality, and it will happen at some time or the other, sooner or later, for an individual, for a company, for a family, for a community, and for the globe, as we have seen with COVID-19. The crisis may come. So what is going to determine how well your organization or your community weathers the crisis will be a combination of three factors. The first one is the quality of the plan that you had in place. The second one is how well you implement the plan. And the third one is the flexibility of your plan. Because as you, Dan, rightly mentioned at the beginning, it doesn't necessarily always happen exactly as you contemplated it. And so the implementing team have to be on their toes and have to be flexible and willing to make changes as and when necessary. Now, the second, another point that I would like to make is that a crisis can have a range of effects on you as an individual or as an organization. So the crisis could take you out completely, which will be a disaster. The crisis could weaken you considerably, which obviously would be sad. The crisis may touch you moderately, and you then recover over time. Of course, the crisis could actually make you end up better. And what all of us will be looking for is, what can you do to actually rise with crisis? And organizations have actually been known to rise after a crisis. Now, the fifth alternative, which most or many people will ordinarily think is a neutral one, is that the crisis leaves you unchanged. But I think that would be sad. If the crisis leaves you unchanged, that would be sad, because it means that we have not learned the lessons of the crisis and we have not taken advantage of the crisis. So what are the best practices that I would recommend that would ensure that at the end of the day, we are actually better off in a crisis? And in sharing some of this, I will talk briefly about my personal experience or some of what I have applied in recent times at Emerging Africa and what I have applied in my former life, including in my personal life. So the first I would say is identify your greatest enemy and your greatest weakness in peacetime. When the skies are blue, the grass is green, there's no cloud on the horizon, that's the best time to identify what is my weakest point and what is my gravest danger. Drawing from the example of financial services, which is where I've always worked, weakest point would be liquidity, people, and many times operational challenges. So if I start with liquidity, what do you do when you are running a financial institution? You make sure that even though you think you don't need them, but you put your credit lines in place. And in my former responsibility, I always ensured that I had credit lines in place that were multiples of what I would ever need. I never drew on any of those credit lines, but I just made sure that they were in place, because as a financial institution, if you lose liquidity, you're gone. Now, people also is a major risk. So what is the quality of your succession plan? How well have you backed up all your critical personalities within the organization? And for operations, I think one of the reasons why a lot of African financial institutions and have been, and not just financial institutions, so many institutions have been made more vulnerable during the COVID-19 crisis, has been because we have been slow to adopt technology, digital technology in particular. And so the learning point for everybody is to make sure that the capability to operate digitally is strong and is actually in play even when there is no crisis. So first point is identify your biggest weaknesses and challenges and fix them, man them very well, even whilst there is no crisis. Second thing would be have a trigger and a responsible person to kick off your disaster plan or your crisis management plan. And here I would have to give a personal example. So point I'm making is you could have a plan and yet you might not use it simply because there was no identified trigger and there was nobody responsible, and later you realize that, oh, we could have applied this plan and things would have been much better. So I once went on a family vacation and we all had our travel insurances in place because it was a requirement anyway for our travel visas. And then I arrived, and the very day I arrived at my destination, I got a call that my mom was dead. And we had to cancel everything, drop everything, and return home. And it never occurred to me that I had an insurance policy that covered all our travel expenses, all the holidays, all the accommodation, the flights and everything. But in the confusion of the moment, I went and we started booking fresh flights and canceled everything. We never took advantage of that policy. And all that money was wasted. We didn't repeat the holiday. So the point I'm making is that many times organizations put in place elaborate plans and then you lock it up somewhere and you actually don't pick it up and implement it early enough when you need to. And by the time you eventually come back to it, a lot of the early opportunities have been missed. So make sure you have very strong triggers to trigger the plan and to put it to use. Communicate early and keep all stakeholders informed. All stakeholders. I believe you build trust. You build trust in the way you communicate. And when you communicate openly, it helps to get everybody on your side. The last 2 points I will make is be willing to change early. I have found that the early adopters and those who make changes fast, they are able to pick up momentum and to gain from the crisis. And the example I will give is that very, very early into the COVID-19 crisis, we switched to virtual operations. We didn't miss any board meetings or any internal meetings. We switched everything to virtual operations. We moved all our staff home about a week before anybody else in this market was doing that. And within a month, we started retraining all our front desk physical officers to operate digitally, and it worked. And we found that business did not slow down, and our visibility on digital platforms and the consistent webinars, the kind of things that UUBO is doing now, gave us presence of mind before the market, and kept us, active and visible. So I think I will stop there and just say that if we apply some of these best practices, we can weather the storm better, and we can actually move ahead instead of being slowed down or our business is being destroyed by the crisis, no matter what the nature. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tony. I almost thought we had lost Yomi, and I was going to switch to crisis mode and deal with and perhaps go back to Chris early. But Yomi is back. So Yomi, perception managers. Or perception management is what you and your organization does. Vitally important. So look, Can you share with us your thoughts on best practices or any recommendations you have for us in relation to how a company that is confronted with a crisis should deal with communication and both internal and external perception during a crisis? Yomi?
Thank you very much, Dan. I'd like to appreciate UUBO for giving me this privilege to speak on this platform. I also do recognize my other panelists, Chris, and of course, Toyi, the sister to my brother. Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to start with this. The day was the 22nd of October, 2005. And I remember that very vividly. A plane took off from Lagos Airport, bound for Abuja. And perhaps at that time, that was one of the most popular flights. It was a Saturday evening. And it was one of the leading airlines in Nigeria. And for some reason or the other, it just went off the radar. And I'm talking about the Bellevue crash that happened, and we lost 117 persons on board. And that was my biggest baptism of crisis management. Not only because we were working for a client, but because a lot of people who were lost in that crash were people we knew personally. And I had the displeasure of accompanying the CEO of the airline to visit families of those who had died in the crash. And, you know, I remember the first house we went to, we weren't sure that we weren't going to be killed. I mean, it was so raw. The anger, the anguish was so raw that we need. So it gave me a ringside seat in managing crisis. And I'm going to encapsulate this within a few slides that I have prepared. My focus will be on crisis communication. Crisis communication. I know Tony has spoken about crisis, maybe from the corporate governance point of view, and I know Christopher has shared his thoughts with us, but I'm going to focus really on communication. So if you could share my slides, thank you. I will be able to just speak to those slides. Just about 3 slides, just to put it in. Can I have the slides? Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Next one. Just keep on going. The next one. So what I've just tried to do is to put it, yeah, we talked about crisis communication. Sorry, go back please, because Chris told us about crisis, but in terms of within crisis, according to Modern K, it is the information that is exchanged by and between public authorities, organizations, the media, affected individuals, and groups before, during, and after a crisis. My next slide, please. And I'm going to speak a bit about the importance of crisis communication. I have it here, so it's not following. One, the importance of crisis communication includes to protect stakeholders. You want to support the interest of those stakeholders. You want to build trust in the organization, protect that organization. You want to take control of the narrative. It is very important within a crisis for the organization to be in charge of the narrative. And I'll speak a bit about that when I talk about managing crisis in the digital age. You must make sure that you have your own narrative in. One of the things that happens, we have what we call a holding statement. Even if you don't have the total picture of what is happening, the first thing that if a journalist should reach out to you and say XYZ, make sure you get your story into what he's going to publish, because whether you give him a response or not, he's going to publish his story. And within that same medium, you want your own. And a holding statement is something that may not define what the issues are, but you're saying there that, yes, we acknowledge that this has happened, and we're investigating, and very soon we will come back to you. Until then, please reach out to us for any information you have, and so on and so forth. Only recent, I think this week, we had a bank, one of the leading banks. There was a report about their information system being hacked. Last week, a telephone went up in flames, and so on and so on. You must get your story within that. Then two, it helps, you must build and maintain positive relationship with all your stakeholders, and I think Tony mentioned that. And then it ultimately contributes to the growth of the organization. Now, if we, in a survey that we, looking towards it, we found out that only 41%, a survey by Deloitte, only 41% in 2009 corporate organizations had some form of crisis response mechanism, even up to the board members. And that's really very sad. That's really, really, really very sad. And I think Dan then mentioned that at the beginning. So what are the things you must do to manage crisis? And I'm going to speak before, I'm going to speak during, and I'm going to speak after. Every time, even before the crisis comes, you must always carry out an issues audit, just to know exactly where you are. You must develop what we call a crisis manual. And that crisis manual is so that you know what to do and when and who to do. And we've done this survey also in Lagos. We don't have the report yet. The number of organizations that have crisis manuals, that have developed manuals, and it's supposed to be your Bible to follow in the event of a crisis. One of our clients, we used to work for them, a big oil firm, and I believe they still do it. They have a crisis manager on 24 hours. So that person is trained to manage the crisis. So if there's a problem, you go to that person. You must design a stakeholders map. Even before the crisis, you must develop approach, and we talked about the various steps. Now, what do you do during a crisis? You must have a crisis team, and that crisis team must be the lead in what is being done. I think Chris mentioned this, you must always maintain transparency. People who have said otherwise, they found themselves in a big hole. You must always tell the truth, no matter how difficult, no matter how bad it looks. You must always take responsibility. It's not time for you to start saying, oh no, it's not my fault, it's this. Take responsibility. Even when it doesn't, you're not sure it's yours, you can say, yes, you know what, we're looking into it, we're on top of the situation, and we'll give feedback to you. You must, of course, act very fast. And I think Toyi also mentioned that communicate. Now, after the crisis, you must assess the reputational damage, because one of the biggest things you lose in a crisis is your reputation. You must develop a strategic approach to restoring that reputation and as an organization. And I'm going to say something here. The companies that quickly recover are those who have invested in their reputation before the crisis. And many of us will remember in 2004 when we had the Indomie issue. Indomie, Chris, is a noodles company, like noodles company. And some people had consumed it and died from it. And immediately what happened was that, so there was this outcry and so on. But because Indomie had invested so much in the progress of education and so many other areas, social things in Nigeria, it was very easy for the public to understand where they were coming from and forgive them. Now, before I go, I just want to say to you that the dimensions of managing crisis have changed. When I joined this business in the late 80s, when you have a crisis, it takes you 24 hours for the crisis to blow open, because it will be reported by Punch, This Day, The Guardian. But now, in the days of citizen journalism, it's completely different. So what happens instantaneously can take shape and can define. Only recently, a former minister got himself involved in a few, in some fracas with the media. In those days, there are things that your client would have said to you, oh, kill that story. So that the journalists there, you let them say, oh, please don't publish this and all that. You can't do that anymore, because immediately it's happening, it's going global. So the dimensions of managing crisis is completely different in these days of social media. So you need to invest in social listening tools, which gives you early warning signs. You need to respond swiftly. You need to know which platform should you use. When should you use WhatsApp? When should you use Facebook? When should you use LinkedIn, and so on and so forth? And again, you must lead the conversation. I have a few quotes, and I'll come up to that. Let me take that one. Then my last slide on that will be a few quotes. Some of them Chris has already mentioned. It says, "A crisis is a terrible thing to waste." That's Paul Roman. And the important thing there is that with that crisis, you can leapfrog, because it gives you an opportunity to reshape. It brings you an opportunity to start your conversation again. It gives you an opportunity to show what stuff the organization is made of. Warren Buffett says it takes 20 years to build a reputation, but 5 minutes to ruin it. And then Andy Gilman says the secret of crisis management is not good versus bad. It's preventing the bad from getting worse. And I will agree. No, I can't agree more with what Andy Gilman is saying. Thank you. I will stop here, and I'm sure we can go into the nitty-gritty of the conversation.
All right.
Thanks,
Yomi. I'm glad that I quoted that old saying about no plan surviving contact with the enemy, because my plan has not survived contact with the quote-unquote enemy. The plan at the start of this webinar was to have a second round of questions, but actually I think that the comprehensive nature of the initial comments by Chris, Tony, and Yomi, and then also some of the questions that I have seen come in are so interesting that I think that the various participants will probably find it more interesting, actually, if we switch directly to questions, because some of the questions I'm seeing are real life, okay, as opposed to the potentially more conceptual questions that I would have asked in a second round. So if that works for everyone, I will just go through some of the questions that have come in and pose them to either Chris, Yomi, or Chris, Yomi, or Tony. I'm sorry, in no particular order. In other words, not in the same order in which you first spoke. But it just so happens that one of the most interesting questions that I have seen on the Q&A is actually a question that I think Chris will find intriguing. Let me see if I can pull it up. Okay. So Chris, this question's for you. And it's from an anonymous attendee who I hope is still with us, since we're answering his or her questions. And the question is this. The participant asks, in many institutions, the standard practice of crisis management that involves personal misconduct is to deal with the issue internally first, prior to resorting to an independent investigation. The participant then goes on to say that in some cases, this may result in a tension between the two processes, and asks what is the best way to ensure that there is a balance to enable objective outcomes in the event that both internal and independent processes are deemed necessary. So Chris, any thoughts on this, and anything from your experience that we can draw on? I think we have you on mute. Yeah.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are now.
Okay. As you say, Dan, it's an intriguing question, and you are right. I mean, in many cases, we've seen this play out actually, that for example, that there is a complaint of misbehavior by a senior executive, which is embarrassing and difficult. And the view is taken that should be investigated by someone internal but independent, for example, maybe another board member or someone. And that investigation is done, and let's assume that it clears the alleged wrongdoer of misbehavior. The risk, of course, is that new information then comes to light, and the internal investigation was found with hindsight not to have been robust, and therefore one has to have effectively an external investigation, maybe done by a barrister or external lawyer. And of course, the combination of those events is very awkward, because it ends up with the institution looking as though they have slightly covered things up rather than been as candid as they might have been about things. So in answer to the question, over the years, I think I have become wary of internal investigations. And I think often best practice where misbehavior within an organization has come about is for you to move directly to a genuinely independent investigation. And typically in the UK, that would be by appointing an independent, experienced employment barrister to interview the various parties, come up with recommendations, and for those recommendations to be placed before the board, so that effectively you obviate the need to go via the internal process, and you go straight to an independent party to evaluate things. Honestly, I think that is preferable, because you thereby avoid the risk of having something that will be seen like a whitewash in due course. You don't waste time. Instead of having two processes, you have one process, and hopefully you can do that pretty promptly, because what is for sure disruptive and unnerving to everybody is to have the alleged wrongdoer under a cloud for too long. And at the end of the day, you have something that you can point to when discussing it with other stakeholders as a genuinely one-step independent process that you've gone through. So my answer to the artful question really is that I have become less enamored of the internal process, because one does find that too often it is not the end of the matter, and you make matters worse for yourself rather than better.
This particular question is one that really strikes close to home, because it's one that that in the firm we've been confronted with situations like this, and I guess, Chris, the follow-on question, and this is from me as opposed to from the participant, is: so if the wrongdoing involves the CEO, the CFO, somebody really senior, in terms of UK practice and just in terms of your recommendations, is it your recommendation that the person stays in place while the investigation is taking place? Or should the person step aside, go on leave of absence or gardening leave, with the risk that doing so could taint that person's reputation?
Dan, it's an incredibly difficult question, because you're right. And to some extent, I think it depends on the nature of the allegation. If the allegation is one of perhaps multiple behavioral inappropriateness within the organization, I think it's probably impossible for that person to simply carry on. So that person will probably need to be, quotes, suspended, unquote, whilst the investigation proceeds. Now, you are of course right that the danger of that is that effectively the investigation becomes self-fulfilling because everybody just assumes guilt because the person is not there for reasons that are probably shrouded in some degree of mystery. But there will be circumstances where that's simply unavoidable in all propriety. In circumstances of, if you like, lesser contravention, maybe elements of sort of bullying behavior rather than harassment behavior, it's a fine line. You will have seen this, for example, the Jockey Club. I don't know if you've read the press in the UK, but the chief executive of the Jockey Club was being criticised for, quotes, bullying behaviour. That person was not suspended whilst the investigation was undertaken. The investigation proved to be that the allegations were founded, and thus that person has now had to resign. So, answer, it's a question of degree, but one needs to judge it very finely, because you're right, that the danger of suspending someone is that, you know, that they may be, as it were, denied the chance really to genuinely prove their innocence.
Okay, well, thank you. That's actually, hopefully that addresses the question that the participant asked, and it's also helpful, I think, certainly for our investigations, compliance and ethics practice. So look, question for you, Yomi. An anonymous participant has asked, who, from your experience, is the best spokesperson when faced with a crisis? Is it Stephen Hayward? Is that the BP gentleman, Chris?
Tony Hayward. Tony Hayward.
Yeah,
it didn't go very well for him.
Is it a Tony Hayward?
Went very badly for him, actually.
Yeah. Is it a Tony Hayward, or is it a Tony Hayward with prior training? Should it be the head of corporate communications in the organization, if there is one? Or should it be an external party such as yourself? So okay. That's the question for Yomi.
All right. There should only be one face. So I'll give you an example of the Bellevue. We worked with a team from the Lloyd's of London, the insurance group. And basically what we did was that every morning and evening we had a meeting. The crisis team had a meeting. And then we agreed on what had to be said. And it was the CEO who represented the organization. Why? Because the buck stops at that table. Two, he can make certain commitments that people believe that it will be binding on the organization, and then, of course, affecting. So let me give you an example. When the CEO of the airline said, guess what? That aircraft was insured, and therefore there will be compensation to all those who died, and the compensation will be paid XYZ. So what happened is that he led the charge. But the follow-up discussions, people are coming in, they want more information, can be handled either by consultants like ours, like we are, or can be handled by the communication, head of communication. They can do the follow-ups, but the face of it should be singular, and in most cases, if not in all cases, I would advocate that it should be the CEO, except in a situation where the CEO himself or the leadership of the organization has been compromised in one way or the other.
Okay. And if, sorry to be impolitic, but if you sense that the CEO is not a particularly good communicator, you have a client and the CEO is not a very good communicator, and there are many reasons for that. Either he or she lacks the words, or because even unintentionally he or she comes across as being arrogant and unsympathetic at a time when an absence of arrogance and empathy is required. As a perception manager, what would you do at that point?
Well, I would suggest, and remember I said we should rehearse. In my presentation, I talked about rehearsal. So we need to prepare senior executives for that role, and not just the CEO, but maybe those who are in the C-suite, because we don't know who will be there. So take, for instance, where you have let me say like a plane crash, or the CEO was lost in some circumstances. Anybody in the C-suite should be able to step in. So what we do is that regularly we take them for training, sometimes twice a year, once a year. We prepare the organization for training. Yes, we do have some people who naturally falls into, it comes naturally to them, and then some people we've got to coax them a bit more. But one of the areas we absolutely try not to let the CEO go is to speak off the cuff in a crisis. You must try not to speak off the cuff in a crisis. Even if it looks as if you're speaking off the cuff, it must be somewhat scripted, because a reporter can lead you down a path you really do not want to go. So you must be able to say, when he's going down that path or she's going down that path, you bring it back and say, says, why is this blah, blah, blah. And so thank you for that question. It's a good one. But I think we should focus our attention on blah, 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 blah. That way you keep the interviews, you keep your media interaction within context. Now, if the CEO is not good at it, in the event that the CEO is not good at it, reluctantly, we will take somebody else from the C-suite. But more often than not, for strength, for confidence, we think the CEO should do it.
Okay, I think that's clear. Tony, I have a question for you. Question from Anonymous. An interesting one, actually, because this is real life. And the question is, how do you balance the interests of an organization in crisis on the one hand, and the various stakeholder interests on the other, assuming that these interests are not aligned? So, this person raises an interesting question, because there are different constituencies in an organization, including actually the interest of the organization itself, which is a separate legal entity. And so sometimes sometimes these interests may not be aligned. How do you, as a CEO, how do you balance these things when a crisis occurs? That's the question.
Thank you, Dan. And like you've said, this is a live question, and this probably mirrors some of the decisions that CEOs have had to take in the wake of COVID-19. And I'll give you an example. So where the company needs to cut costs drastically because revenues are going down as a result of the pandemic and as a result of the shutdown of markets, we have had companies having to look at whether to lay off staff who are critical stakeholders, or whether to keep the personnel at all costs. Now, my candid opinion is that you have to take the decision that will aid the survival of the organization through the crisis. So the interest of the company comes first, and that is the real interest of the company, not the sentimental, emotional interest of the company, but what, after all the analysis have been done and the information has been gathered and critically reviewed, what you are sure will help the organization to sail successfully through this. Because if the organization itself collapses under the weight, let's say, for example, of expenses that have not been adjusted because you're trying to take political decisions, then in the long run, all are dead. So if the organization itself goes down, everybody goes down. So it's kind of like when you're on board a flight and you have to put on your own seatbelt before you can put on the seatbelt of your child. So I would say put on the seatbelt for the organization, make the organization survive. Of course, in taking some of those decisions, you can then look at how to cushion the impact, how to make sure you are taking, you're transparent in how you arrive at the changes that you're making, and how, laying off should be a last resort after you have looked at maybe job sharing and other objectives, But at the end of the day, you put the organization first.
Okay.
Because remember, it's the organization, it's because there is an organization that they are board members. It's because there's an organization that they're shareholders. It's because there's an organization that there's a taxman who will collect taxes. And it's because there is an organization that there's staff who will collect salaries.
I will remember to quote you the next time shareholders associations are on the warpath, because they would argue that that shareholders precede the organization. But that's a conversation for another day. So I have a question for Chris. Again, look, these are the real challenges that people face. And the question for you, Chris, is, and I can feel the pain of the person who asked this question. The question is, how does the executive team deal with an unresponsive board that ignores the signs of an impending crisis? So dark clouds on the horizon, and Vesuvius on the verge of erupting, and the board is, I don't know if I'm mixing my analogies here or my metaphors, but the board is fiddling away while Rome is burning.
Yes.
How does the poor executive team deal with this?
So, and it's a great question. 2 points, I think. If I were the CEO, watching Vesuvius erupt, and I've got a rather disengaged board, and despite my efforts to warn them of the impending doom, I would do two things, actually. Number one, I would rally the executive team, and I would say, look, this is basically a challenge for the business and the operation and finances of the business that we, the executive team, are going to have to manage. In normal circumstances, we would help for more support and the right kind of challenge from the board. But we must assume, because the interests of the organization are paramount, that we may not get that. So we must prepare ourselves to be as robust as we can to handle the eruption of Vesuvius and its fallout without the level of air cover that we might have expected from the board, point one. Point two, what I would then do, to be honest, is I would work out which of the senior advisors had the best connection with the chairman. Very, very often you will know whether it's the lead lawyer or the lead investment banker, but you will, as a CEO, you will know someone who genuinely has the ear of the chairman. And I would say to that person in confidence, look, I have some concerns privately that the board is not realizing the scale of the challenge that is going to engulf us, and the fiduciary duties that the board members have at stake in all of this. Please, can you help me to find the right way to communicate the gravity of the situation to the chairman and make sure that the message lands with the chairman? So those would be my 2 points. Be confident in developing a plan on the executive side, and then use diplomacy levers available to me to really get to the chairman and explain to the chairman not only that this is an important situation, but actually that the board have their own fiduciary duties at stake in all of this. It's not something that they can just wholeheartedly delegate to the management, but they have a duty to the organization, and they will be judged adversely if they do not step in as they ought to.
Right. Thank you, Chris. That's again, these are the real life situations that people face and organizations face. A question for Tony. An anonymous attendee would like a little clarity around the connection or the relationship between a risk register, which was, I think, referred to in one of the presentations, and a crisis management plan. Are they the same? Is one an input for the other? Can you shed light on this?
Thank you, Dan. So your risk register is just a register or a record of the risks, all the risks that you face as an organization. And it then provides an input into your crisis management plan, because your crisis management plan must address what happens if any of these risks should materialize and if the situation were to escalate to a crisis level. So your crisis management, both documents are important, and you keep your risk register on an ongoing basis, and you update it from time to time, and then you update your crisis management plan probably less frequently, but that also has to be updated. But these both documents are critical and very important to the organization.
Thank you, Tony, for clearing that up. A question for Yomi from an anonymous attendee. Yomi, we need you to man up and tell us the truth on this one. So the question is, at what point do you advise your client to own up and take responsibility to minimize the damage? i.e., have you ever walked away from a client? So, look, you, me, Chris, we're all advisors to CEOs like Tony. And here's the thing, we only advise. CEOs and board do not have to take our advice. So, what do you do, Yomi?
Well, I think at a stage, you must decide if your professional integrity and your own professional reputation is at stake. At some point in time, you must be able to say no, especially if it has to do with things that are unethical. In some cases, you find some clients will say to you, oh, you can do this. Why not? Just do that, do that. And you are sometimes the first line of backfiring. And so if you yourself then have to manage the crisis, it's like you lawyers, when you are in a case and then it gets to a certain point that your integrity is at stake, you have to draw a line at a certain place. Because let me tell you, one of the things that is very attractive during crisis, the shortcuts. Very, very attractive. And somebody comes up and says, oh, don't worry, I know this person. Especially for us in communication, we can fix this. I can speak to the editor. I can speak to the publisher. He's my friend, and so on and so forth. So you've got to be able to put your foot down. And we've had instances where we have sharply disagreed with our clients. And you find sometimes somebody in the room says, look, let's listen to them. And what do we stand to lose? One of the things that I found out that it's when you're in a crisis as a consultant, you cannot afford to lose your head, and you cannot afford to be emotional in dealing with the crisis. So again, like you lawyers, when you defend people, you can't afford to get into the case emotionally. You want to be as practical as possible, because that's only when you see the tree, you see the forest rather than the trees. So have we walked away? Maybe at the beginning we've had, because in another case we had another air crash, and based on our performance with that one, we were to be hired. But when we realized that the client wasn't going to comply, and then there were certain things that were not in place in the second crash, including insurance and all of that, we declined to do the work.
I think that is as clear as as clear as can be. Look, an anonymous attendee asks a question, and it'll be interesting. I think that maybe this question I will pose it and see if anyone's first up to answer. Ask a question I think that each of you can answer or contribute to, and the question is the following: how can we do a better job managing risks while they are still in their potential form and there is a level of control? And the question goes on, how can risk managers convince senior management and shareholders? And I suppose also, although this wasn't included, and the board, more than shareholders, that it can be worthwhile buying umbrellas in the summertime when there are no clouds in sight. So
I'd like to give this a shot.
Please, Toy.
Yeah, because I think it was actually the first point that I made when I was presenting, which is that in terms of best practices for crisis management, that one of the very best practices you can have is to essentially have in place robust and comprehensive risk management in place. And whilst everything is going well and there's no crisis in sight, that's really your best defense against crisis. So crisis will occur from time to time, but the incidence of it, how big an impact it has on your business compared to other businesses, will actually depend on how well prepared you are for every possible eventuality. So when they say only the paranoid survive, I am an ardent believer in that. And that means that when you are at rest and everything is going well with your business, you should have a very regular scoping of what could possibly go wrong and put in place all forms of defenses that you can afford to put in place against those eventualities. So if we do that, when we do that, I know at Emerging Africa, when we started operations, we decided that we were going to put all our information in the cloud and that we were going to set up in a way in which we could operate virtually if we ever needed to do that 100%. There was no COVID-19 in sight. This was a decision we took 2.5 years ago, and we made sure it was a policy that every single staff will be equipped with a laptop as opposed to a desktop for all staff of all levels. We never knew that COVID-19 would happen, and then it happened. And so it was very easy for us to switch. We just shut the office and everybody started working from home. We don't have any physical servers. So the point I'm making is at all times, everybody in the organization should recognize that they are risk owners and they should take ownership of the risks of operating in business, and they should assume if it can possibly happen, it just might, or it probably will. And when we operate from that mindset, we will be better prepared. So I totally agree that this is the way to go.
All right. Thank you, Jack.
Yeah. If I may chip in there also, there's something we call, and I'm sure many of you have heard it, Murphy's Law. What will go wrong will surely go wrong. And one of the things I think Toy's mentioned is we just must prepare for all eventualities. I remember a personal experience of mine. A friend of mine, a staff of mine had lost his mom somewhere, Papaja or Mushi, and on a Sunday afternoon, I decided to just go and visit the family and commiserate with them. And as I was driving out of the street, I looked to my left, I looked to my right, and I thought I didn't see any car or I didn't see a vehicle, and I was just about to move out, take my foot off the brake and press the accelerator. And there was this motorcyclist with a whole family of about 3 or 4 on that same motorcycle, and he just nipped right in front of my car. And I was shaken to my marrow because I kept on saying to myself that I preach crisis management. In that flash, I saw my car hitting the family. They were wearing, they were coming from a white garment church or going because they were in the outfit, and I could see the blood, and I could see the other motorcyclists mobbing me. And I started thinking to myself, Even I didn't have a response. Is there a button I can press on my phone that the nearest police station or people from the next police station can come to me wherever I am? And here I am, I preach the gospel of crisis management. So you cannot over labor it. I think labor the point. Again, you must have a plan in place. Not just have the plan in place, you must consistently revisit and revise that plan. Because once the crisis happens, it's like a catalyst thing, something else then takes off from there, something else then takes off from there, and before you know it, it has spread beyond what it is.
Sorry, Chris, please.
No, I was only going to agree emphatically with Toyin and Yomi, and the only point I guess I would add is this, that without doubt, prevention is better than cure. So as a board, as a chief executive, you're always going to be better off preempting something bad, a crisis, rather than dealing with the fallout from a crisis. And therefore, which is the same point that they've made, it behoves you really to work to minimize the risks of things going wrong. It's also, of course, an appropriate discharge of the fiduciary duties of the board, that the board should be aiming to minimize, to the extent realistically possible, the damaging event that can befall a company. Some of them can't necessarily be foreseen, but to the extent that they can be managed in advance, they should be.
Okay. So, Chris, one last question for you, and this may well be the last one, so we can wrap for 3:30 as promised. And the question is the following. From an anonymous attendee who asks, during this COVID crisis, the lines between the board and the executive were almost blurred in managing the crisis. And the participant then asks, what is the role of the board in effective crisis management, and how does it differ from that of the executive team? Chris?
It's a good point, actually, because what we saw in the crisis actually was quite a lot of companies having weekly board meetings, and so there was this combined effort on the part of the executive and the board to manage their way through the process. To my way of thinking, the role of the board, as for many it was, and probably should have been really, was to monitor the response that the executive team of the company drove to the crisis. So I think the essence of the non-executive board role really should have been to mix support with challenge, so that it's the CEO and his or hers team, their role to say, here is COVID, this is the way that we're going to deal with the liquidity crisis, this is the way that we're going to deal with the health crisis, this is the way that we're going to deal with the supply chain crisis. The role of the board, I think, is not to second guess all of those decisions, but with the right empathetic mix of challenge and support to say, are you really sure that that is the way to go about that? Have you consulted all the key stakeholders? Is there a regulatory angle to this sort of thing? So it's a more finely tuned supervisory role, but not seizing the executive levers from the management. And I suspect, and your questioner is very astute, I suspect that some of the non-execs rather crossed the line in the crisis and perhaps muddled the role of the executive and maybe trod on the feet of some of the CEOs. And that may not have been the right way, really, to manage the board's role in the crisis.
Thank you, Chris. I think we may have time for one more question. Try and see if I can find a short one.
Dan, could I just to mention one which I think is very interesting, Jerry's question around empathy. I think that's
Yes.
an incredibly hard point because, you know, I think a major challenge, you know, if you have, and it's the point around an air crash, you know, if you are a CEO and your business has been responsible for death and sadness all around, how do you strike the balance between genuinely expressing grief and sorrow and yet not exposing the body corporate to undue risk by way of somehow accepting liability? So I think that is a very, very good question and a very hard judgment for quite a lot of corporations to make. I don't know if Yomi has a view on that.
Yomi, any?
Yes, empathy. You know, again, falling back on my own experience then, what we decided was that the family was the most significant in the whole process. So we decided that, one, the company will cooperate with the Accident and Investigation Bureau. Government regulations submit everything, but the family was number one. So we then took it upon ourselves with the CEO to visit as many family members as we could. We didn't get around to everybody because not everybody was in Lagos and not everybody was Nigerian. But by the time we had done 3 days of that or thereabout, we found out that the word had gone round that the organization was showing a lot of empathy. We set up lines so that all calls were answered no matter how frivolous. We had issues of family members storming the business premises in anguish, and we had a priest and I think a Muslim scholar or somebody, but we had like an empathy team, and we set up somewhere like that in the office, wherever when they came, they were counseled, and we just let them know. And of course, in the face of all of that, there were so many stories that were being peddled, or the captain wasn't trained to fly a plane, so many things. But we concentrated more on the family. So in the events of death, I think that should be the focus of every and any organization. The other things can fall in place. And you find out that usually when you show that kind of empathy, people get to line up behind you in a way that we found out that some of the families of the victims were the ones that were advocating for the organization and say, oh, let's listen to them. They're good people. They've done well. And they've even brought in some suggestions that could help in resolving the crisis.
So,
empathy is key. Empathy is key.
So you've heard it from Yomi. I am now going to be an advocate of and for Yomi's services, perception management. Absolutely.
But thank you for bringing it to the fore, Dan. Thank you for bringing it to the fore, because many of us really, truly were not prepared for any form of crisis whatsoever.
And Dan, there was, I don't know if you remember, but the case of Thomas Cook in the UK, there was someone died on a Thomas Cook holiday, and the CEO of Thomas Cook expressed regret, but was everybody thought too late in saying sorry. And the view at the time was that had that word been used sooner, then some of the anguish could have been moderated. And there was a feeling really that there was sort of maybe too much worrying about legal constraints and not enough empathy, to Yomi's point.
So clearly what I hear is the lesson here is get in front of the crisis and be clear, honest, and empathetic in your communications. Yomi, is that a fair?
Definitely. I would advocate that anyway.
And if I may add, usually victims at that time are not really concerned about the legalities of anything. They're not even thinking about the financial claims at that time. They just want to know that somebody cares, and they want to know that the person that represents the only entity that they think they can hold responsible, that person is wearing a face that shows that they care. And I think anything we can do to make them comfortable at that time as well. So whilst you're waiting for legalities and finances, just go out of your way to make them as comfortable as possible, make it as easy as possible to access information. Some of the things that you may have said will make all the difference in the world.
All right. Look, I think Tony will have the last word on this. And Tony, thank you very much. I'd like to use this opportunity to thank the panelists. We've had a brilliant panel. Chris, Tony, Yomi, brilliant. I have certainly enjoyed the last hour and a half. Thank you for your initial contributions and then also for your open engagement with the questions. One of the things that has struck me is that this acronym we have here, we call it the ICE September series. And ICE is, I think, appropriate here because whether you're in a crisis or whether you're in the middle of an investigation, a compliance procedure, or there's an ethics breach, ice water is something that it is useful to have in your veins. So if you agree, and if you would like to find out a little bit more about how this plays out, as Lolade said at the beginning of this session, there are going to be 4 more webinars on different subjects on every Wednesday, on every other Wednesday during the month of September. And we look forward to the participants joining us if you can. So on that note, thank you again. Thank you to the participants for all of your brilliant questions. It's been great having you. I guess we can call it a wrap. Thank you all very much.